Hi, this is Justin Paperny. I think it was Gordon Gekko who said in the movie Wall Street, money never sleeps. Well, white collar crime never sleeps because it's about 6 a.m. on the 24th of March, and I'm going to conduct an interview with a client, but really also a very good friend, Mike Brothers. And I know I've done okay as a consultant when I'm invited to a client's wedding. So thank you very much for inviting me to your wedding. It's a privilege to be with you. And we're not so much going to talk about you today, but your parents who were clients, and through this time we formed a close friendship. And we've worked closely together, and I'd love for you to share some of your thoughts as we talk about what to do when the feds show up. Before I transition to that, I'm going to post some resources that a lawyer wrote called When Law Enforcement Comes Knocking, One of Your Options. So I'm going to put up that link for others to gain some perspective from a lawyer. But Mike, let me jump in before you give us a little introduction about yourself. When law enforcement comes knocking or when the feds are investigating, what do you do, and what did you and your family do?
Well, what our family and I did was basically stick our heads in the sand and could not believe what was going on and basically ignored it for over a year, which was a poor decision. What you should do is act quickly and act decisively, and that includes talking to the feds openly and honestly. It means reviewing your documents to see what kind of case you might have. But in reality, 97% of cases that are tried federally, or 97% of indictments, end up resulting in a plea deal. And therefore, the quicker you plead, the better off you are.
Right. So a lot of people, when I was in federal prison, a lot of people regretted that they didn't accept responsibility sooner. And admittedly, it takes a long time to get there. You know, you mentioned living with the head in the sand. I did the same thing for more than 2 years. And you look back and say, oh my God, how can I have not accepted responsibility sooner? It was a slam dunk case. So when the feds came knocking, I believe it was in 2013, did you not think you guys had done anything wrong? Did you think there was no criminal intent, or they showed up and left and you didn't hear anything for a while, and were you like, it's sort of all good, case closed, let's move on with our life? So walk us through what happened after they showed up in the coming months. Did you think, hey, this is all just behind us?
Well, it was funny. I was finishing up my doctoral thesis at the time, so I wasn't actually in a different state when I got the phone call from my parents. Mm-hmm. And my father did a proffer. Turns out later I found out it went very poorly.
But let's talk about that. Why did it go poorly? Because many of the people watching this, you proposed this idea to me to do this video. I love it. You said, Justin, I found your videos on prison life, probation. They're valuable, but there needs to be more information about when someone's getting indicted or being investigated. The people need to understand the decisions they make then are as essential as what they might say in the pre-sentence investigation or at their sentencing. So why did that proffer go poorly? And for those that are watching, how can your proffer be more, end up better than it did for your dad? Why did it go poorly?
Well, I actually did a proffer myself after I kind of barged my way in to talk to the federal prosecutor in 2015.
Okay.
And when we discussed it with them, basically my father did not seem forthcoming. He seemed very defensive and very agitated and very much the smartest man in the room. Mm-hmm. So I think the key thing is to make sure you humble yourself and try to provide as much information as possible. And being apologetic, I think, is a much better strategy than being boisterous and acting like you're holier than thou and that what you did was right.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting. Upon my release from prison, I gave a lecture at the FBI Academy, and some defendants have said, well, why would you do work with the FBI? You're a convicted felon. You served time in prison. They arrested you. And I understand that. I went to the FBI to help them understand how they could better do their job and investigate white-collar crime. That's why I did this large lecture. And in that talk, I discussed how I acted very similar to how your dad did in that proffer when I was meeting with the FBI for that initial interview. I was a little dismissive, a little arrogant, didn't view what I did as criminal. And I was a little nervous, but mostly I was living in denial. So I'd like them to better do their job and understand the mindset of a white-collar offender, because if they do, the outcome will be better for everyone, specifically, defendants. So denial was a huge component of my misleading the FBI. I flat out lied to them, which was a case of obstruction they could have charged me with. Was your dad also in a bit of denial? And moreover, had he totally come clean with his lawyer? I did not come clean with my lawyer when I had an interview. I hadn't totally owned what I did. So when he sat for that proffer, besides being the smartest guy in the room, was a little bit of denial, like I don't really want to come clean because I have this perception of myself as a law-abiding citizen. Did that hinder his ability to have a productive interview?
Well, I know that you have an interesting story about this as well, which I think would be interesting to share afterwards, but I think the problem is that a lot of white collar crimes, not all of them, but a lot of them are through omission more than they are through criminal intent.
Yep.
So my father, for example, wasn't as forthright with his paperwork as he should have been, but it wasn't until further investigation that we found out the extent of it. And at that point, our lawyer had ideas about what might have happened, but nobody really knew the truth until about late 2014, early 2015, which was over a year and a half, 2 years later from the proffer.
And during that, so let's transition to that. So you have the proffer, there's the interview, the investigation continues. You weren't as proactive as you could have been. You didn't prepare for it as you could have been. Time went on, the investigation continued. And quickly, let me transition and talk quickly why the time matters. The more, from my experience and many of my clients, I've been doing this full time since '09, the more the government has invested in your case, the more blood or vengeance they're going to want at the end of the day, because they can justify, well, yes, so-and-so might have eventually accepted responsibility, but they have made the government invest, money and resources and time over an extended period of time. So at times they can justify that time or resources for a longer prison term. And unfortunately, this case just did not ensnare your father and really you, because it detracted from your career as a doctor. It also brought your mom into the mix. And I know when you reached out to me last year, how did you find me? And what were some of the initial goals that you had? And walk us through the pain, knowing that it wasn't just your father, but it was also your mother. And you said to me, we have got to keep my mom out of jail. So give us a minute or two on, I guess, how you found our work and some of the next steps once we began working together.
Once it was clear we were going to criminal trial, I started doing a lot of research and started, putting my PhD skills to work and really digging through the document trail.
You were a paralegal practically full time.
Exactly.
Right.
More exactly a overqualified paralegal. But yeah, so I was digging through the documentation, and it was clear that there was a pretty good chance that my father was going to jail, and that my father had not been completely honest with us and to the lawyer about what had been truly going on. And maybe it was a mission, maybe that was knowledge, but regardless, we understood we were in a much worse position than we expected. And so I started looking up things about federal prison. I ran across your videos, and I found them informative. But I also found some of your other things about how can you get a lesser sentence, potentially through making them view you as a human and not as a crime.
Right.
And therefore, from that, I said, I need to pick this phone call. And we ended up, my brother, my sister, and I ended up hiring you on part-time to bring you in.
And one thing for you viewers, I remember telling Mike on our first call, I said, Mike, my work isn't right for everyone, because not everyone is willing to implement the strategies. This isn't just make an investment, sit back and listen. For this to work, the defendant has to proactively convince all stakeholders, the prosecutor, the judge, the probation officer, the person who's going to write your pre-sentence investigation, that you are different than some out-of-character decisions you made. And I will not be there at that pre-sentencing interview. I might be at the sentencing, but I'm not going to be making the statement to the judge. So I knew you and your brothers and sisters were willing to work, right? The issue was your father willing to work? Was your father willing to prepare for the best outcome? And also your mom, and as you promised and worked on this essentially full time, they both totally embraced the process. They both began to change, I think, the way the government perceived them. But they also worked more effectively with their lawyer. Now, you have a very good lawyer, but that doesn't change that I helped you implement, or I hoped I helped you implement some strategies to work more effectively with the lawyer. And I share this to those of you who are watching, because if you have a criminal defense attorney, how do you often know if it's a good or bad lawyer if this is your first experience with the criminal justice system? So I provide a sense of oversight, not as a lawyer, I don't give legal advice, but as a former prisoner who made a lot of bad decisions, who didn't work as well as I should have with a lawyer. So tell us how you held your lawyer accountable so well, and how you think that influenced the outcome for both your mom and dad. And you were fearless, because you said, my highest value are my parents. We've retained this lawyer. So walk us through the relationship with your lawyer and how you held him accountable.
It was funny. In the beginning, I did not like our lawyer because I thought that he thought my father was guilty. Yeah. Turns out I actually asked him blatantly if he thought my father was guilty. He says, I assume all my clients are guilty.
He said that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's what most defense lawyers believe, and that's kind of a key thing to remember. So when you're talking their ear off, wasting your money, remember, they think you're guilty.
And, and just like jurors do, I think with the 97% conviction rate, it's easy to presume if it says your name versus United States of America, or vice versa, I guess, that that you're guilty. So, okay, continue on with the lawyer and how you think they began to get more on your team and work towards the best possible outcome.
Well, Gary and I started working together, and I was digging up documents to provide a defense for my father. And of course, while I was digging through them, I also came across documents that would basically ultimately convict my father.
Yep.
And I found the key documents that made our case untenable. And as Gary and I talked, and we realized quickly we needed to resolve this via plea. And I blatantly asked him, I said, what would you do under your circumstances? And he said, well, the other lawyer would tell us to take a plea deal. Mm-hmm. And looking after everything, I said, yes, that would be the bright move. Turns out there was a plea deal offered back in 2013 in August that would have been for less prison and also to would have kept my mother out, as opposed to the deal we ended up with.
Now, it's interesting. You said something to me in your notes, think like a prosecutor, not like a desperate, delusional defendant. We talk about what to do when the feds show up. Part of the reason we're creating this video is because you're early in the journey. Those of you who are watching, you don't know what steps come next. You might spend up online on Google researching white-collar crime and become very scared and nervous of the next step. So if the feds come calling and or investigating, I think this point is very relevant, where you write, think like a prosecutor, not like a desperate, delusional defendant. In 2013, when they showed up, had you thought like a prosecutor, the outcome would have been different, right? Walk us through that a little bit, because that's so relevant, acknowledging that the cards might be stacked against you, and you have to use that to your advantage, as tough as it might be.
In 2013, when they showed up, at that point, they had not interviewed other employees of Valley Forge. They had not interviewed the vendors. It turns out through my investigation, I discovered all sorts of interesting things that we could have used to our advantage with the federal feds in terms of throwing other people under the bus in order to get a more favorable deal.
Yes.
However, we did not do our thorough investigation until 2015, when these things came to light and became very relevant. And by that point, they had no interest in listening to us because they had already formed an alliance with those other people.
So let me tell you why that's interesting to those of you that are watching. There is in white-collar crime, often the person that is least culpable gets the worst sentence. So in my case, for example, even in my sentencing memorandum from the government, they wrote that my conduct was aberrational, that I was swept into a crime while working at UBS and Bear Stearns. However, because my co-conspirator, to his credit, owned it and cooperated and took responsibility sooner, even though he really facilitated and orchestrated this Ponzi scheme, because he cooperated and got in first, he was looking at like 2 years, and I was initially looking at 5 years. So the criminal justice system is twisted. I get calls from many defendants who say, I'm the least culpable, I didn't have criminal intent, however, I'm the fifth to plead, and I'm going to get the worst sentence than the guy who created this. So much like your timeline, and I'll put this up on this video, on the 28th of April 2005, I interviewed with the FBI, and sort of like you, nothing happened in my mind for a year. I got a real estate license to make money, to pay the lawyers for the civil cases that came. I sold real estate. I was just that ostrich living with my head in the sand. Then 1 year later, and I'll put up the release, I read that my co-conspirator had pled guilty, and for the prior year he had been cooperating. And when he called me, they were aware the feds were listening. And I said, oh my gosh, the last year while I thought this was just behind me, he's been cutting a deal and cooperating, and that's why I'm looking at a much lengthier prison term, despite not having intent. And some of that is the case. Primarily, I think with your mom, had they just addressed it sooner, it could have not led to an indictment for your mom or a guilty plea. So let's transition into the plea agreement. I will acknowledge not all plea agreements are accurate. I'm not saying they don't accept responsibility, but read some of these press releases. Sometimes they're a little bit one-sided. So walk us through the day of signing that press release, of recognizing had you faced this sooner in 2013, the outcome could have been better. Was it tough to sign that plea, and what happened after that plea agreement as we advanced towards a pre-sentence investigation and sentencing?
Well, there are two separate plea agreements. So fortunately, and this is where I would say your advice on how to manage our lawyers worked out well. My father's plea was hard to sign, but that was taken care of first.
Yeah.
Then my mother was left. And my mother had a plea agreement, and they decided to knock down the charges instead of all of the charges to misprison a felony, which basically means that
you knew a crime was going on. Right.
And therefore, we got it down, so instead of a maximum of 20, it was going to be a maximum of 3. Mm-hmm. And they were willing to not oppose probation. My mother went into plea, and there was a fact dispute where they alleged that she touched the electronic components where she did not. And she said she did not. Yep. And the judge threw the plea out.
Threw it out.
flat out threw it out, said he did not believe that she understood the complex export laws, which, to be fair, was completely accurate because I barely understand them and I have a PhD in science.
Right.
But going back to this, the prosecutor was very angry. His email was very much one of vengeance, seeking punitive damage for the fact that the plea deal got messed up. And it was by me holding my lawyer accountable and having him take responsibility for the failed plea deal that we came back in front of the judge with another misprison plea, but this time using the deliberate ignorance statute,
Yep.
which I think in the end of the day saved my mom from going to prison.
Right, that was some good work that we did. We were. I remember you called me immediately after the judge didn't accept the plea. We acted swiftly. You reached out to the lawyer immediately, and we'll get into your dad's prison term shortly. But one of our primary goals was always ensuring that your mom never endured the indignity of serving time.
And I do want to
in
make
prison.
one thing clear.
Yes.
During the actual trial itself, at the end, the judge said, I've never taken someone down from a sentence of 2 years to probation, and my mother was the first.
Right, and your lawyers worked hard. You worked hard. Michael Santos and I worked hard. Of course, Michael is my partner and colleague, was involved in this case. That was a huge win for us and some positive in what was a trying experience. Let's transition to let's talk a little bit about the news cycle and the stigma that accompanies a criminal conviction. And something, your father's a proud man. I've grown very close with your family, as I mentioned. I live in Los Angeles. You invited me to your wedding in Kentucky. We become close friends, and this is personal for me. And having lived through some of the fallout and the reputation, how have you managed the news cycle, so to speak? And how are you standing by your father? And how is he proving worthy of the love that you give to him? How are you going to hold him accountable during what turned out to be a 93-month prison sentence? Walk us through your family's next steps, with my help, of course, to succeed through a lengthy prison term.
Well, first of all, I think we ended up going through at least 3 or 4 news cycles. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I will admit on my end I did well, and I'm not saying this is the best strategy, but I had a news source. So I had him leak the stories. Mm-hmm. I thought that worked out well because when my father was first pled guilty, only one news outlet carried it and not all news outlets. So that was very useful. Mm-hmm. The other thing is we did have one front page of the local paper, and it did get around to everyone. So the point is things are getting out there. Stories are going to go global. They're going to go national. That's just how these go. They want to embarrass you to deter other people from committing similar conduct.
That's right.
The nice thing is that it tends to be a very short news cycle, and we tend to be very ADD as a society with regards to our news cycle. Mm-hmm. The good thing I did, though, is basically reaching out to family and friends first and saying, hey, this is what's going on. It's not as bad as it seems, but this is the truth. Mm-hmm. And ironically enough, as you had an older wedding invitation, I started dating my fiance 2 weeks before my parents were arrested. Mm-hmm. And her parents were not very happy about the fact that she was dating the son of 2 indicted cons.
There's fallout from it. Totally, absolutely. I'm actually going to do a separate video. I was in this Esquire magazine actually talking about dating after prison, and it's also dating after prison. It's not so easy to tell a nice woman I just got out of jail. So I faced the stigma as a felon, and you faced it having done nothing wrong. You're just the son. So I totally understand what you're going through. Please go on.
Okay, anyway, so we're talking about that. So the biggest thing is talk to friends, family. They're usually more understanding than you think. We've had some amazing friends support us through all this. And I think the biggest thing is breaking down the shell because it's so easy to realize you've been persecuted. My father's serving 93 months. I believe it could have and should have been handled civilly, but we as a country imprison too many people every day. Mm-hmm. We just have to accept the fact that that's how our current criminal justice system is set up and take political action to rectify it. But you can't feel sorry for yourself. You have to be taking due diligence. We got my father into RDAP, which will likely cut down the
2 years.
Yeah, 2 years exactly. So now all of a sudden we're looking at a prison sentence of 5 years incarceration term, yep. And we were able to get him by talking during the PSI into the local facility in Ashland, Kentucky.
Yep.
So he's only about 2.5 hour drive away. So my mother and I can see him.
Yes.
And we're obviously taking the checklist seriously to make sure that my father uses the time in prison wisely and doesn't just sit around and watching TV for 5 years.
Right. So I'm going to put up a link to that checklist. You did have very good lawyers, but some lawyers don't fully understand the residential drug abuse program, the criteria, the document, the evidence that needs to be included at the right time. And I think because of the steps we put in place that legitimately disclose your dad's issues, we got it on the record in time, and it will be a shoo-in for him to get into RDAP, to just get in and also complete the program from which he'll benefit. I want to close with something, and I'll never forget you calling me. I had mentioned to you, and this video might go longer, but that's okay. I think this is valuable content. I remember when I admitted responsibility at my sentencing and in my letter, my personal narrative to the judge, which all of you should write. I talked openly about the bad decisions I made in facilitating a crime at UBS, and I had to be held accountable. My mother wrote a measurably different letter, and stating that she thinks I was swept into an aggressive corporate culture, that my senior partner should have been held accountable. And my view is fundamentally different than my mom's. And she's my mom, and she loves me, and she just couldn't imagine that I had done this. You called me and said, Justin, do I have to write a letter and agree with everything my dad said? I think this should be civil. I don't agree with all the facts of the plea agreement. And I said to you, just be yourself. So walk us through, you right here, honesty is the best policy. Leave your pride at the door. You maintained your dignity, Mike, because you didn't acquiesce and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. You're the son who had done nothing wrong. Walk us through how you maintained your dignity. You told the truth in your letter. And don't you feel good that you didn't acquiesce, that you didn't give in, that you maintained what you thought to be true? Walk us through that for defendants and families who might be watching and thinking, I see this differently. Do I just have to give in? So walk us through your thought process on that. I think it's valuable to be yourself.
I had read all the documents, and then thinking like a prosecutor, going back to thinking like a prosecutor,
Yep.
They're trying to tell a story and looking for facts to support their story. As a scientist, I'm trained to look at data
Yep.
and tell a story through the data. And it's completely, it sounds similar, but it's different because they come to a conclusion first and find facts to support their conclusion. Mm-hmm. Through my process, I found data to support a new conclusion that kept on constantly changing.
Yep.
And that's why I basically wrote in my 30-page letter where I cited documents, I showed, I did research into the components we were selling, I did research into what the vendors did, into what employees did, and really looked into everything deeply. And I told the story. And you know what? I'm not sure if it impacted the judge or to what extent. I know the one part that got quoted by the judge frequently was the part that helped land my father in RDAP, mm-hmm. which was very key and crucial.
Of course.
But at the same point, I know that I did everything I could in my power and told the truth. And the narrative, I think it told a good story. And during my mother's sentencing, there were many things that came up that sounded like it came directly from my mother's letter.
I want to transition as we close to two thoughts. One, if you'll notice in this video, there was no blaming from Michael. There's no blaming from his parents. He's not accusing the government of necessarily overreach. He even acknowledged, he thinks it should have been civil, implying there might have been something wrong. And I share that because part of the reason their experience as a family is better than some white-collar defendants is because they're not excusing. They're not blaming. They're not rationalizing what happened. They said, these are the reality of the situation. We have to embrace them as the world is, not as we'd like it to be. And, Mike is voluntarily sharing this story because he knows as we speak, people watching this are being investigated. And they're making decisions that are going to change the trajectory of your life. And this is a cautionary tale. He wants you to take more action than just wait as I did, or wait a year hoping that things are going to go away. So I admire you for telling your story. I admire you for owning it and helping your parents as much as you did. And do you have any closing thoughts for our viewers as they embark on their own journey through the criminal justice system as you advance towards your father going in and your mother getting sentenced to probation? Any last minute takeaways or anything you'd like to share?
I would just say that knowledge is power, and the quicker and faster you educate yourself and realize the system you're dealing with, it is a unique experience, but you need to be educated just like anything else in life. And every day is precious, so seize the day. Mm-hmm. And finally, life goes on. People have gone through much worse in the course of history. Right. If you look at Sir Thomas More, he got beheaded for being Catholic when King Henry wanted a divorce. This is a part of life, but it's not like you are going through the worst thing in history. So just try to keep some sense of perspective throughout it.
And let me close with one of the first conversation I had with your dad, where I said, Lou, you might get sentenced to prison. We can't change that. We'll do the best we can. But don't let them get one day longer in prison. And he said, yeah, I already feel in some ways like I'm in prison. And I said, so you have to be productive. You like to golf, you like to bike, you like to exercise, you love to spend time with your wife and your children. You are not in jail. Live every day to the most, as cliche as that sounds, because you are not in jail. And one of my biggest regrets was I only got an 18-month sentence, but I felt like I served 5 years because I was in limbo for 3.5 years. So your dad said to me, Justin, it's going to be tough, but I won't let them get 1 day longer than my sentence. And as he gets ready to go in, I'm supportive of your family. You guys are great. I'll be here throughout the whole journey. And I'm just really grateful for you taking the time to share your story. I'm just I really love and respect your family very much. So thank you very much for sharing your story, Mike.
And thank you, Justin and Michael, for so much for just guiding our family through this, because we got more done in the last year and a half since we hired you in 2015 than we did in the prior 2 years.
Well, that means a great deal to me. Okay, thanks, bud, very much. Thank you.